And good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great end of the month. New Year's is right around the corner. I'm definitely looking forward to it. As you know, we'll be at Waifu Fest for the Con Hour. We'll also be working the event, so looking forward to that. And it is New Year, so we're going to be bringing in the new year with a convention. What better way? But we are here with author Joel McKay, who's had several awards under his belt, and I think one is with journalism, if I'm correct. So, welcome to
Yes.
the show.
Thanks, Craig. Good to be here. Yeah. Where do you want to dive in, man?
Oh, well, let's dive in with some of the research that you do because I know you got to do a lot of research for the stuff that you write.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the fiction or do you want to talk about sort of the nerdy economics and rural development research? I'm guessing probably the fiction's more on par with your audience, right?
I think the fiction will be pretty good here. And hey, Stephanie.
Yeah. To be honest with you, so my background is as a journalist and writer. I've been writing for, since I was 12. Like it's my thing. I always wanted to be a novelist. I became a journalist because I thought that was a pathway to get paid to write full time and eventually become a novelist. I was right about the former and not the latter. If you want to become a novelist, you actually just have to focus on that. It's a completely different skill set. But in that sort of career I had as a journalist, I became a pretty good researcher. And I was a business and financial journalist, so that kind of turns my crank. So I read a lot. I obviously keep up to date on news. Being a former journalist now, being a news junkie is just part of the DNA. So when it comes to my fiction, most of my research is, to be honest with you, I am looking at the craft itself, the skill. So I'm really researching what other authors are doing, how they're structuring stories, how character development is progressing, how that's happening over, a length of time in terms of like a word count, how you bring together, an ensemble of characters and smash them together and see how that plays out and reacts. So I tend not to do, at least at this point, a ton of hard research into my fiction to get things historically accurate. So what I mean by that is you might run into an author who, that I'm sure you have, it writes historical fiction. Well, if they're going to do that, they're going to have to do a ton of research, right? They got to really nail the details in order for it to come alive for the audience. In my case, with my novella, it's a werewolf horror comedy about a family Thanksgiving dinner. There's not a lot of research there other than, have you ever attended a dysfunctional holiday dinner? And pretty much everybody has. And watch some werewolf movies. But what I think makes it work is how it's crafted. Which is an ensemble cast of characters. You've got 7 or 8 points of view, and about 13, 14 characters, and it's only 130 pages long. And, bouncing back and forth between all those different points of view, making it work, having story progress with a clear beginning, middle, and end, was the challenge that I took on. I would say, thinking back on that, was it the smartest thing in the world to have my first novella be an ensemble cast of characters with all those different points of view and try and cram it into 129 pages? No. that probably wasn't a good idea, but I'm sure you can appreciate, like, sometimes it's almost like you don't have a lot of choice over making things easy. It's kind of like what turns your crank. So in that case, that the idea for that story really turned my crank and it turned into something. And I was very interested in, to the craft point, seeing how I could create conflict. That was, as a writer, if I take the story out of it and the werewolves ripping people apart, I think the thing I was most interested in was, can I make really unlikable characters? And how do those unlikable people interact with one another when you stick them all in a house, add some alcohol, and then eventually some werewolves? And so that was kind of the experiment in my brain, and I ended up finishing it, obviously, and it got published. So to the research question, yeah, like there's that's kind of where I'm focusing the research right now. Not to say that might not change in the future if I get a hankering for something that requires, me to take some of those journalism skills and put them to use.
Well, it's interesting that you said that, because I had written 2 novels, which I'm working on the 3rd. But I also wrote a novella, which was a Western.
Oh, yeah.
And there is a big difference, because you have to really compact it and put the story into the compacting, and putting even just a little bit of a background can take away from the story, but you still got to do it a little.
Yeah. I'm curious in the Western. So there was a call for a Western anthology, as a horror splatterpunk Western anthology last spring by Bridget's Gate. And I love Westerns, like just absolutely love them. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to, go out on a lark here. I've never written a Western. I've watched a lot of Westerns. I've read some Westerns. I'm going to write a short Western horror story and submit it. Well, lo and behold, it got accepted and published, and it came out in an anthology earlier this year, and it's a great anthology. I'm shocked by some of the talent that I'm published in there alongside. But one thing I discovered, and this kind of goes to the question to you, was like, I wrote a 5,500 word story. What I was thinking about was, if this thing was any longer, I would actually have to do a bunch of historical research to flesh out areas and sort of timings and locations, technologies, and stuff like that. And so I wonder, what was your experience in writing that novella? Like, had it hit that length where you needed to actually dive in and do a bunch of research?
I had to do research on the weapons, what kind of weapons they had back then, how many shots they could hold, how far they could shoot. And also, because of the time period, I had to learn a little bit about the land and it's what they called the land grab, and how much theft there was during that time, actually. Because land grab was basically, the government was handing out land deeds if you worked the land, but like the people in charge of the towns would hand it to their friends and not the people who were actually moving up that way, or people would steal those documents. So, I mean, there was actually a lot of research and a lot of fascinating things that you learned.
Yeah. What I find interesting about that, I tend to want to always place my fiction in Canada. Partly because, largely, I would say, actually, because A, I'm Canadian, and B, people always say, write what you know. But when it comes to the Western, one thing I discovered is you can set Westerns in Canada, no question about it. But we had a very different experience because we didn't have the Civil War, and we also had a national police force that settled out west ahead of most of the settlers. Whereas in the US, you kind of had what you just described was that land grab, right? Like the people were out there before the law, and a lot of those people were Civil War vets. And so you had that Old West experience. It was very different than the Canadian experience. And I found, as an author, like, I would love to dive in and do more Westerns in the future, because I just love the genre. But at some point, I'm going to have to make a decision around, how do I write that classic American Western gunslinging adventure yarn that we all love, but put a Canadian angle on it that is somewhat historically accurate. And I don't have any answer to that at this point in time, except that it's been rolling around in my head for a little while.
Well, it's interesting because the Old West was actually just a short time period. And it's like, okay, it was actually after the Civil War, but before the 1900s. And you're actually looking like at about 1882 to about 1890. I mean, It was like 8 to 10 years.
Yeah. It's funny like that. I've noticed that too. I did a bunch of reading a few years ago on the Klondike Gold Rush, because the Gold Rush came up through British Columbia. And what struck me immediately when I started reading about the Klondike Rush was that it was really from 1897 to 1899. So it's like 2 years, 2.5 years max. And one of the interesting things when you read about that is that there were people who left Edmonton or who left California, and they decided to go the overland route. And by the time they actually got there, it was over. and yet it figures so largely in the consciousness of, the western part of the continent, which is this idea of a gold rush. And it almost leads you, if you didn't do the reading, it leads you with this idea that, it must have been going on forever. And it's, well, no, actually. No. To your point with the Old West, where it's only really like 8 or 10 years where you had like the tombstones and other things like that playing out. Kind of the same with the Klondike rush, at least. There were different rushes, but at least with that one, it was pretty short.
That was actually interesting because I did a little bit search on my ancestry, and I actually had one relative that ended up missing for about 2 years, and I actually found him in California. So he actually went to California for about 2 years for the gold rush.
Okay. That would have been what, the 1849 rush
in
around San Francisco kind of area, I think.
Yeah. So it was quite interesting because it's like, okay, well, he was here for a few years and then he went back. It's like, what happened?
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it then, at least, I guess, as a creator, it brings a whole bunch of other questions up, right? Like, what was going on? Like, in those 2 years, what did that individual experience, right? What was it like traveling back and forth? Did they get ahead? Was it a total loss? And, there's probably a million stories in that.
And not only that, but it was like, okay, did something happen during the Civil War that made him want to leave? Or, I mean, there could be so much.
Yeah. It's funny. So I grew up, as I was saying to you before we got on here, I grew up in Vancouver and I was born and raised there. And then I left about 10 years ago and I moved up to the northern part of the province, and where I live now is Prince George. And when I left Vancouver, everybody told me, like, you're crazy. Why are you going up north? You should go back east, go to Toronto, or stay here, or go down to the States, right? Like, there's nothing up north. And I'm like, no, I want to go up north. I feel drawn to it. I like the lifestyle. Well, it turns out, and I knew a bit of this from what my grandmother told me, but I didn't know the depth of it. But my great-grandfather had settled 2 hours east of Prince George in 1914. And my grandmother, who I knew quite well, who lives in Vancouver still, she was born and raised here, just east of here in a tiny little town, her and her sister, and then actually went to high school here in Prince George, which I had no idea about until I got here. And then eventually, after the war, moved down south where she met my grandfather. But when my daughters were born, they were the first of the family line to be born in northern BC, since my grandmother had been born here in 1930. And so there's that real connection point. And then the other night I was goofing around on the internet, just searching up old family surnames, because there's always new information that pops up as government documents get loaded. And I found what we call in Canada an order in council appointment by the provincial government in 1958 that appointed my great-grandfather to what we call regional hospital boards, which is like a group of people from a geographic area that provide sort of policy advice on healthcare delivery in a rural area. And so he'd been appointed to that in 1958. Well, it turns out he was also the last member of the family who had been appointed by the provincial government to a sort of representative position until me. When I moved up here a few years ago, and the provinces appointed me to a couple of other boards for things. So there's weird connections like that you kind of discover over time if you start to peel back the onion, that your bloodline, your people have sort of circled through these areas in the past. You're not the first. And it makes you wonder, at times, was it really just me that wanted to live up there? Or is there some memory baked into myself about, living in that part of the world? And that's why I ultimately ended up here. So who knows?
I mean, it's fascinating, but from what I've been told, even listening to you, it's pretty country up there.
Yeah, it sure is. It's gorgeous. It's certainly, there's the impression that I think a lot of people have when you look at the map of Canada that there's nothing there. And that's not true. There's all the big cities, but if you go basically, above your Vancouvers, your Calgarys, your Winnipegs, there's towns all the way up. They're just small towns. And they're often separated by, 60, 70 miles or so of countryside. And all that country is beautiful. In the case of northern British Columbia, like it's all pretty much mountains. So, or an interior plateau. And so you live in this landscape of extremes. It'll be last week it was close to minus 50 with wind chill here, and it can get as high as plus 40 in the summer. So that's a 90-degree temperature shift in a 6-month period, and it'll be lots and lots of snow in the winter, and your lakes are frozen over, and even some of your rivers are frozen over, and it looks like that classic Canadian landscape in the mountains. And it's beautiful. And then in the summer, it's green. It's green all the way up into the territories, and it's full of life and absolutely stunning. And you get super long days. The sun in the summer here doesn't go down till 10 o'clock at night. So you get what you lose in light in the winter, you more than gain back in the summer. So yeah, I feel like I've stumbled on my own personal paradise. It's not for everybody. You got to like the outdoors, but
and the cold.
And the cold. Yeah. You gotta. Yeah.
Just so people know who are in America, when he said negative 50, he was referring to Celsius.
Yeah. That's I was. Yeah. I'm trying as I'm talking. You're trying to do the calculations in my head, and it's pretty rough. But yeah, there you go.
No, I think I'll stick with. I like my summers here more than I would like those winters.
Yeah,
that's saying a lot.
yeah, it is. I hear what I hear because I got 2 cousins in Houston. They tell me that hot, sticky in the summer, and that's. Though I've also heard like a lot of people give Texas a bad rap, but like my understanding of it, it's full of awesome people. It's a beautiful country. It's got a lot of the same things that Canada has, where you got wide open spaces and lots that you can do outdoors and lots of history. So it's on my list of places I would like to spend some time and better understand. But yeah, it's yet another one of these places where everybody's like, Texas, it's just full of, Republicans or whatever else. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I mean, my parents live in Idaho. It's a Republican state, and it's beautiful, and the people there are super nice. So I worry sometimes about these reputations that places get, and I often find when you go to them, not accurate.
It's not accurate. I mean, you have such a mixed variety of people. Yeah, you are going to have your butt heads, a-holes, whatever you want to call them, but you're going to have your nice people too. I mean, it's a variety.
Yeah.
I mean, that's everywhere though. I mean, so there's really no judging any place.
No, I'd say though, the one thing that you probably get in Texas that we don't get as much of is you get some giant bugs down there, and I think some of them have venom. Yeah. We don't get that here. I'll take the grizzly bears and the wolves and the moose any day over the venomous insects and reptiles.
I mean, we have a few snakes and spiders, but I think we're a little bit safer than Australia would be when you start considering that.
Yeah, I think everywhere is.
But anyway, where can we find some of your work at?
A few places.
Do you have a website?
Yeah, I don't actually, and I keep getting bugged about that. Joel, you got to get a website. I'll be real honest. I've just finally gotten serious about fiction in really the last 2 years. It's just happened since the pandemic. I think for a lot of us that became a catalyst for other things, and for me, it became an outlet to create. So you can find me on Amazon. That would kind of be like the home base for a variety of my work. So, and then social media, Twitter, Instagram, Goodreads, you can connect with me there. So I'm like a lot of people now. I'm in a lot of different spaces and not centralized in one. I will have to get a website probably in the new year. What can you find? Of my fiction, you can find my novella, Wolf at the Door. It's out there. You can get it on Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, pretty much anywhere you can kind of buy books, you can find it. And then my shorts that I have out, there was one which is a supernatural comedy fishtail called Number Hunnerd. It was in an anthology published by Tyche Books last year called Water, Selkies, Sirens and Sea Monsters. It's an award winner in and of itself. The anthology is, not the story. And then a splatterpunk Western story called Hands, which was in Bridget's Gates Press's Western horror anthology that came out this past fall. Called Blood in the Soil, Terror on the Wind. And then I've got 2 more short stories coming out here imminently. One is a science fiction story set in the near future called The Ministry of Labor Transition. It'll be out online for free to read via Bewildering Stories in the next month. So if that's kind of your jam, just pay attention on my social media feeds. I'll be promoting it there. And then I've got another horror story coming out via Erie River Publishing sometime, I think in the first quarter of the new year, in another water-themed anthology. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
You did. And they can find your social media, just Joel McKay or...
Yeah, so Joel C. McKay. I never correct anybody. Don't feel bad about it. It's pretty common. Even I will say, even amongst the McKays or the McKays, we all pronounce it differently, right? So don't worry about that. So Twitter is Joel C. McKay. Instagram is author Joel McKay. LinkedIn is Joel C. McKay, and Goodreads is Joel McKay. So pretty easy to find me if you Google me. Turns out there's not many other Joel McKays out there that write prolifically. So you can find me in Google in the first couple of pages pretty easy, and certainly you can on Amazon.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on our show today. And for everybody else, we will be back on tonight at 6 p.m. with Lizzie, our co-host. We're going to be interviewing her on cosplay and a few other things that she has a wonderful story that people need to hear, or should hear, rather. And like I said, this weekend we will be at Waifu Fest, which is going to be at the Hobby Airport, Doubletree Hobby Airport. So look for us there. And for those that are just joining the show, hope y'all had a wonderful Christmas and y'all are going to have a wonderful New Year. Until then, everyone, adios.